And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Heather Schlaman from the Yolo County Office of Education, so she can introduce herself. Heather?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Schlaman. I work for the Yolo County Office of Education as an English learner specialist. I'm actually here with Yolo County administrators whom you can't see because none of them wanted to sit at the tables closest to me. But I had the privilege of reading an early draft of one of these modules and providing some input and feedback, and I'm happy to be with you today. And it is now our pleasure to introduce Dr. Aida Walke, Director of the National Research and Development Center to Improve the Education of English Learners.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be joining in this webinar. And I want to begin by thanking both Eva and Heather for their kind support of the webinar and for using the vehicle. And of course, we want to thank the YOLO leaders who are attending the professional development because they have to sit through the webinar anyway. Since this is just the introductory stage, I want to say that I direct the center which carries out research and develops tools and processes to make available to all kinds of educators, whether they're leaders, policymakers, teacher educators, or teachers themselves. And you will hear more about this. So let me introduce to you now George Bunch, who has been really pivotal in helping us conceptualize the modules we'll be talking about. So George.
Thank you, Aida. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. We've got 95 participants right now, including not including everyone who's in Heather's room right now, and maybe some of you are also joining with groups of people. So my name is George Bunch. I'm a professor of education at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and had the pleasure of creating one of the modules that we'll be talking about later today. So I'll be with you a little bit later to talk about that. And for now, I will pass it, I believe, back to Eva.
Thank you, George. We're almost ready to start with our overview of the modules. I'll just mention a couple of housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A window to send us any questions that you have, and we are going to be saving them for the end of the webinar. And if you haven't done so yet, please introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. And so now we're going to jump right in. As you know, the purpose of this webinar is to introduce the modules. It's almost like a teaser, what we want to provide you, so you can explore them later on your own. And no one better than Dr. Aida Walke, who is responsible for these wonderful resources, to tell us about them. So Aida, how would you characterize these 6 modules?
Well, the modules are there for teacher educators and teacher professional developers, and they provide a series of tools that we have spent a lot of time both developing, finding, locating, and putting them all together in one package. Lee, if you kindly show the slide of the domains of expertise that comprise teacher development, it's based on a model in which, as you can see, there are 6 different domains that develop as teacher growth. We tend to emphasize the one on knowledge, the blue kind of diamond, but we sometimes forget that teachers and all educators need a vision. They need to be motivated and engaged to do the work. They need to reflect individually or jointly. They need to improve their practice, and they need to find out about the overall context. Thank you, Lee. So, in fact, the modules address all of those components in an integrated and coherent way. So one of the values of the modules is that through videos, through interviews, through a number of documents that we put there, activities that we invite participants to engage in, you actually have the opportunity to plug in parts into your course of teacher growth, or you can use the module as a whole. Well, as a whole, the module would take several sessions, so they are expensive, but it is perfectly possible to lift up 3 or 4 activities from the module and use the videos that are embedded there. So it's really exciting to present them to you. They are in general based on an ecological model of education that looks not only at the student and the classroom, but that looks at all the other elements that impact work in the classroom, from policy, testing, and all other aspects. So you may be wondering how these modules came to be. And so you may all recall that in late 2020, we started hearing about this pandemic that actually hit us in 2021. And we had just been granted the running of this research and development center for 5 years. And so all of a sudden, you and all of us were basically at home and having to work in virtual ways. We were developing a number of ways of accessing teachers, accessing educators in general. And so I happened to be in Lima. In fact, I landed in Lima for a short visit, but I didn't know that I took the last plane into Lima in March. And then I actually came back in the first plane that left Lima in October. So trapped in Lima, with delight, trap is the wrong word, I decided that the best thing I could do is really impose on my good friends who were equally isolated in their home and run a series of conversations. So I gathered a list of 12 of the thinkers in the field that I admire the most of them American, but we also have 2 Australians, a British person, and there's somebody from Canada. And so I ran sessions in which I interviewed them for the space of an hour. And to my surprise, the attendance, well, in a way I shouldn't have been surprised, but the webinars, I mean, the webinar where I interviewed, for example, Guadalupe Valdez, had 1,350 participants. Now, that's because everybody was at home, of course. So it was just a great thing to do. So having those videos of interviews with people, it occurred to me that they would be wonderful as the centerpiece of a lot of invitations for educators to deepen their educator expertise, but at the same time to get motivated. Because remember, this was also a time when we were a little bit gloomy about the overall situation. So I thought they could engage us in developing that ambitious vision of what English learners can do, but they could also motivate, help us reflect in general together. And so we started building those modules. So I am going to now actually show you a little video, a little clip from one of the videos in which I interview Magali Labadens. And I will say very little about the module because actually George is going to be expanding on it since he was the one that helped, that designed the module working together with Heather. And so in this video, I asked Magali about the role of policy in the education of English learners. So Lee, would you kindly show us the video clip?
policy, education policy, and education and language policy, how those two come together has been instrumental in the education of English learners in our nation's history and in our state's history and in our local histories. And the implementation of those policies has meant that each of us has a role, despite the fact that sometimes as educators, as teachers, as practitioners, we think that policy, even as administrators, we think that policy resides outside of ourselves and we're merely passive recipients of those policy, passive actors in those policy. But in regards to English learner, we know that we have a very long trajectory of movements towards civil rights and educational rights and linguistic rights of English learners. And then we've also had counter movements against those civil rights, against those educational and linguistic rights. I like to call the idea that Richard Valencia, who just published a book about dismantling deficit thinking in the education of our language minority, which are now the majority in California, children and students in our schools. Because when we look back at the beginning of our educational policies, they really had a very distinct mark that really has created an imprint of deficit thinking and compensatory education. So that the majority of our policies, even preceding the civil rights era of the 1960s, were framed around the lacks of our students, what they were lacking, what they were missing. Education was primarily marked as compensatory education to make up for something that they were lacking. They were lacking in English. We had a system that legitimizes through testing, predominantly standardized testing, predominantly in English, that legitimize further that deficit thinking. And those policies, through standardized testing, through those practices, have further created disruptions in their education, in their equitable and just education. So we've seen things like segregation as the normative practices in our nation's school, assimilation as the normative practice in our schooling institutions. And those trickle down into the classroom, to deficit practices, to the lack of representation of our students and students of color and their histories in our curriculum, in our instructional materials, in teacher preparation, and in actually the professional development of teachers as well.
So as you were able to see, we have the interview, but what makes the modules really special is that they have plenty of invitations for educators to engage in dialogue. So before people view the video clip, they actually are given questions to think about. They are given texts to read, so that the reflection, which is the engine that drives the development of teacher expertise, can actually be there. But George, would you tell us something about the module that you developed based on what you and Heather developed, based on what on the conversation I had with Magali Lavadens?
I would be happy to. Thanks for asking. And Magali, by the way, as many of you probably know, is at Loyola Marymount University and a leader herself in English learner and multilingual learner policy. We use the term English learners to mean students designated by their schools bureaucratically as English learners. And we often try to use multilingual learners for the broader population of students from languages other than English in our US schools. So I will share my screen because I want to do a few things. I want to show you all how to access these modules, and I want to walk you through the module that was based on the conversation with Magali, and you just saw a very small portion of that interview, and we have various clips in the module for participants to engage with around a variety of activities. And so I need permission to share my screen. We had the permission earlier, but I think we were on a practice run this morning, so I will need that. I think I've got that now, so thank you very much. And just give me one moment. All right, so Aida, can you see that
Yes.
screen?
Mhm.
Okay. So what I have showing you right here is the actual overview page for all the modules, and just we will send you all the links, both for the conversations that Aida referenced, the full set of conversations over the summer of 2020, and we will also, of course, send you the link for the modules themselves. But if you want to access them yourself, this is my shortcut, and I just go to Walkie modules, keep it simple. And then the first one that pops up is modules overview, English Learner Research and Development Center. And I click on there and you get directly to the homepage for the modules. Now you also can click here on the full center that Aida runs to see many other kinds of resources for policymakers and educators, and all kinds of other good things being posted immediately upon completion. But we're sticking with the modules for today. And you'll see here, here's the key. You see the overview, that's where we are now. And you'll see module 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So each module is developed around a different conversation. One around a conversation with Guadalupe Valdez, for example, and other key conversations. The module that I created with Heather's expert review and input is module 6. So I will click on module 6 right now, and you will see that takes you to this particular module. This entire module is developed around that one conversation with Magali Lavandens. The full conversation is about an hour, but we have it broken up into smaller clips for participants to discuss. And we're envisioning this webinar today. We're envisioning you as the leaders of working with others on this module. So that could be in professional learning situations. It could be in pre-service teacher education classes, such as the ones I teach at UC Santa Cruz. It could be individual teachers working alone, or individual teachers in self-directed groups. But the developing teachers are the audience of the activities, and we're envisioning you all as the facilitators, just to be clear. So this particular module really is centered around what you heard Magali talking about a few minutes ago, which is each of us has a role in constructing equitable policy and practice for students classified as English learners and other multilingual learners. So it really invites everyone, school leaders, classroom teachers, anyone involved in the educational system, to take some responsibility for this vital role of working toward equitable education for multilingual learners. So there are 3 parts to the module, as you'll see here. Well, we're on the introduction page, which will give you an overview of the 3 parts. And as you can see, I'll see how much of this I can get on my screen, but the 3 parts, part 1 discusses what responsibilities teachers and schools have regarding the education of English learner classified students. So this discusses kind of the policies, the court cases, the laws that make it clear that districts, schools, and teachers have to do something affirmative to meet the needs of students classified as English learners. This is not optional. This is actual federal law, right? As many of you know. And one of the themes throughout this entire module is that we must attend to 2 different ways of thinking about equity for students classified as English learners. And that is making sure that English learners are not excluded from equitable access to what's available for other students, right? And at the same time, taking these affirmative steps when necessary to ensure that English learners have specific supports that they need that might be different from other students. And this, as you know, oftentimes creates some tension or some dynamic decisions to be made. But we're really trying to emphasize and help teachers and leaders understand that both of those are necessary: inclusion and affirmative steps that might be different for other students. Now, this particular part of the module might be particularly useful for pre-service teacher education context, where these topics, court cases, and the foundational laws and policies are often required by state credentialing requirements. And even if they're not, they're often the starting point on pre-service teacher ed courses for preparing to work with English learners. However, we feel they're also really important for working with current teachers and leaders to clarify, as you heard Magali say, each of us has a role. Right? And we actually do in this module take some time to clarify the role of the federal government, the role of states, local education agencies, school leaders, teachers themselves. I find that especially with pre-service teachers, oftentimes they're not really clear exactly on who plays what role in the overall system. This part of the module features a wonderful video narrated by Kenji Hakuta, which situates the rights of English learners in the larger civil rights movement, with incredible footage of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and really making that link between the education of English learners and our responsibilities with the actual original 1960s civil rights movement. Teachers are given opportunities to read and discuss very short excerpts from the actual core cases governing the responsibility of educating English learners. So Lau versus Nichols, Castañeda versus Picard, but also several other court cases that Magali talks about in her conversation that we then in this module have teachers and school leaders and other participants be able to actually engage with and read. And the nice things about these modules, all of them, is that they really spell out interactive activities that you all can use with participants in your professional learning or your teacher education settings. And for me as a teacher educator, it just gives me a little boost for my classes that I've taught for many years. And it's something new, it's something different. It's a kind of different angle on things that I've been teaching for a while. I just want to show you now to go to one of the parts so you can see what it looks like. So I'm going to click on part 2. And what we do in this part of the module is we acknowledge that really nothing can be done to advocate for the equitable education of English learners until teachers and leaders really believe that these students can engage intellectually, that they have incredible resources that they bring with them. And we start by countering deficit thinking, which is something that Magali mentioned in her clip that you saw. And we start with the point that there is nothing remedial about learning additional languages. And this is actually a sort of radical thought, I think, in many of our schools. And so I decided the best way to do this was to share some clips from universities around the country, public and private, Eastern, Western, Southern, about how universities, the top universities in the country, view learning additional languages. And you can see UCLA talks about creativity, problem solving, listening, memory skills. Texas A&M talks about understanding the major cultures of the world and art, philosophy, politics, and economy, how you can't do this without additional languages. And Harvard and Stanford and my own daughter's alma mater, University of Puget Sound, I figure, well, we'll get a really small university in there too. And Mississippi State, right? Academic Senate, a fundamental mode of communication. Language is intimately tied to the social, political, and artistic fabric of societies, right? And then, so we have an activity where we have participants look at these, and then we ask them, is this the vision of learning additional languages that we are opening up to English learners in our K-12 schools? Why is it that the top universities and all universities around the country see this as a major intellectual, social, cultural achievement? And why then do we treat students classified as English learners in our schools as remedial? And so then we unpack that, going into the deficit thinking, the actual original work on this by Richard Valencia in very small doses. You can see this is the entirety of what we ask participants to read. This is new as a college professor to think about how to provide all of these resources actually on an interactive web module with everything open access rather than just assigning a paper or assigning a chapter or a book. So everything you need to do to use the modules is here on the screen, and we try to make them very brief and palatable, but engaging and in depth. And then we have things like the diagrams where we ask participants to do some writing as they read. This particular is examples for educators themselves to note in their own practice, what they hear in the teacher's lounge, what they hear in schools, and concrete examples about educators' discourses, and then they talk about those. And then we move through some very concrete investigations of classrooms and schools. And part 3 is all about what you can actually do about these issues, right? And I don't have time to go through those, but this is where we get to very specific ideas for advocating for English learners, including in very, very small ways. Does not have to be large political action, although that's also fine. And with that, in the theory of this is a teaser and not a comprehensive look, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, I believe, who will tell us a little bit about her experience thinking about some of these modules.
Yes, thank you, George. So I have used pieces of the modules in a few different settings, mostly in teacher education courses, but also in, yes, thank you. Also in professional development. And there are just a couple of things I wanted to highlight from a couple of the different modules. So one of the things that I really appreciate about the modules is that they take these issues that we're addressing, that as school leaders and as professional developers, we're addressing in our professional development, especially in the midst of roadmap implementation, which is actually what the session that I'm in with administrators today is addressing. As we're thinking about the English Learner Roadmap, these modules, I think, really nicely integrate the 4 principles in a lot of different ways. And I really like that it takes the participants really in some depth. So in module 2, for example, it opens with this New York Times piece by Hilda Solis talking about her own experience. She's the Secretary of Labor for the US. Talks about her own experience, asks participants to do just some reflection on the article and on their own experience, something very relevant, something very contemporary, and then moves into thinking about using an article by Guadalupe Valdez and a chart that was created by Aida to look at different conceptions of bilingualism and the ways that so the focus really is how we talk about our students, but it takes us beyond just the words and phrases we use, which comes out in that article where Hilda Solis talks about her own experience being talked to as somebody who wasn't capable and hearing that language from an educator and how that shaped her experience. And then takes us into much more depth in thinking about how we understand bilingualism and how we understand our students and what their language practices mean, and looking at the difference between foreign language and second language and how we see those differences and the ways that we see our students who are acquiring English as deficit, while we see English speakers adding as an additional language as this benefit and this sort of elite acquisition. And that's very much what George was just talking about with deficit thinking as well. And then it moves into, takes you back at the end of the module to thinking about actual phrases that we use in education and having participants reframe those. So I just really love the design of this module, the way that it starts with something very relevant, really moves into something pretty in-depth and thoughtful, and then comes back to, okay, now let's come back to how we actually talk about our kids, and has participants reframe that. And then the second piece that I just wanted to address is that I think that the other thing the modules do really well is they model scaffolding and they model engagement with complex text in really nice ways. So this is from Module 4, and this is just a note taker from Module 4. Participants are asked to, they're asked to do a reading, but then as they're reading, they're not only responding, but they're actually engaging with the text. So the note taker basically provides an outline of the text in this mainstream focus. And the first two columns provide basically an outline. And then the participants are thinking about their reactions and potential alternatives as they're reading, which is exactly the sort of thing we want our students to do. We want them to interact with the text as they're reading. And I think that the modules do a really nice job of showing what that looks like, the kinds of things that you can do with students that are beyond the basic graphic organizers. And then here is another example of that in responding to a reading by Ofelia Garcia, thinking about looking at it from a perspective of additive bilingualism and dynamic bilingualism and focusing on those two things. And so here it's really the idea of reading with a focus, that you're really reading with the focus on these two different conceptions of bilingualism and answering these questions from those perspectives. So just, I think, another really nice example of how the modules not only engage our participants with these ideas in deep and thoughtful ways, but also really nicely model how we can set up these sorts of activities for our English learners and scaffolding more complex texts.
Thank you very much to both of you for having provided a little dive into the depth and the richness of the materials. In fact, as I think of them, I think one of its virtues is the fact that we have done a lot of searching. We've looked for a number of ideas, but we pull them in coherent, interrelated ways. As both George and Heather have pointed out, it's not just about the theory. The theory is there because we need solid explanations for practices, but it usually begins with an experience and it's done in interactive ways because we do value the centrality of interaction in the development of knowledge, whether it's for students, for teachers, or even for policymakers. So another feature is that the modules lend themselves to your appropriation and actually recreation, so you can actually extend. And I want to invite Eva to explain a little bit what she did with an aspect. One module is dedicated to a very interesting word, oracy, and how she has not only used the ideas there, but she has extended them in her own work with teachers. So Eva, tell us about it.
Yes, Aida. Actually, this is module 3, which what I find so powerful about this module is that it introduces that shift from teaching oral skills to the development of oracy. And we know that the development of oracy really is a matter of equity for multilingual learners, for English language learners. And in this module, it's focused around your conversation with Alice Stott, who is the Director of Innovation and Impact at Voice 21. And Voice 21 is an organization, a nonprofit organization in the UK, who's doing wonderful, innovative work in this field of oracy. And I think we do have time to see that clip. It's only 1 minute of that conversation where Alice Stott is defining oracy. So Lee, I believe you're going to help us with the video.
So just like George, I'm going to need some help with sharing the sound here. And there it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that because it is a weird word and we get that reaction in the UK as well. I feel like it's probably even more weird to American ears because it's not a word that's used in America at all. But it's a weird word. It's arguably an ugly word, but it's a word that we've chosen quite deliberately to use. It was only coined as a word in 1965 by an academic called Andrew Wilkinson, and he was exploring the value of spoken language within the UK education system, and he kind of invented it as a word to capture the idea of oracy, so kind of oral language skills being on a par with literacy and numeracy, and I guess trying to kind of put a same kind of an equal footing between literacy, numeracy and oracy skills. And it's a word that we've chosen to use, I mean, in part because of its origins and because of all of the work that's been done on it up to now, which you've kind of alluded to. There's lots of research that's been done around oracy as a concept in the UK, which I'm sure we'll talk about over the course of this session.
So I invite you to explore that conversation more and learn more about oracy and the work that is being done by Voice 21. That concept of elevating oracy to the level of literacy. And we know for language learning, oracy development is essential. And that's why at the San Diego County Office of Education, we are doing quite a lot of work with oracy. And in fact, we've also developed an open source resource that I wanted to share with all of you. It's called the Oracy Planning Toolkit, and it's meant to support teachers in planning more interactive, more collaborative lessons and helping them introduce more opportunities for oracy development. So I'll put the link in the chat in a moment, but I'd also like to mention that in Module 3, you will also find some classroom video clips. And it's a wonderful module, like all of them are. All of them have very detailed instructions for you to follow as you're planning your lessons, even indicating the time that the different activities will take. And I know for professional developers, that is very important, that detailed nature of the modules. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Aida. Thank you so much, Aida. I think we're almost ready to go into the questions.
Yes, before we go into the question period, I just wanted to emphasize ideas that have already been shared by George, Heather, and Eva. And that is the invitations to participants to do something and then come back and interact. And through that interaction, to really gain deeper understandings about issues. For example, there is the suggestion or the invitation to assign readings in a jigsaw format. So for example, to groups of 4 participants, you will assign 4 different readings, but that are coherent and that touch on the same issues. And when they come back the next time, there are questions to help them guide the conversations and enrich themselves. Oftentimes, as a professional developer, as a teacher educator, we say, oh my God, what do I do next time? And sometimes our classes end up being a little bit choppy. We do this on Monday, we do that on Wednesday, and we'll do the other on Friday. But what we have attempted to do is to bring a level of organicity and to the development of teacher expertise. So whether you take a little bit first or whether you use all of it, you are welcome to use any of these materials because they are intended precisely to be at the service of educators. So one final thing I want to say is that we have 12 conversations, but we have only developed 6 modules. So probably in the future, we will develop other modules because each of those conversations with Ofelia Garcia, with Diane Larson-Freeman, with many wonderful colleagues in the field, really merit that. It just so happens that, you know, as you well know, work usually overwhelms it. But we'll go back to that. And now we would love to hear comments from you or questions. So Lee is going to help us looking for the questions that have come. And Lee, you kindly go on.
Yeah, so we had lots of questions about logistics and availability to these resources, which I've tried to keep up with everyone in the chat. I'm answering those questions, but we will be sending out a follow-up email with links to these resources and the resources of our conversation here today.
So as George pointed out, you know, he had a wonderful trick that not even I knew, and you go to Welcome Modules on the website, and then it sends you to a wide amount of, we have briefs. For example, 2 years ago, how to enhance virtual learning was an important thing to respond to, and we provide tools for how to do it in math, how to do it in ELA, etc. There are articles, there are research pieces coming from other parts of the center. And then there are just all the video clip, all the videos, the complete videos of the 12 conversations. And in Alice Todd, in fact, there are 2 video clips from classes in the UK. We are working on making videos of classes this year. And so those videos of American classrooms using the strategies that we suggest are really essential for developing deep and generative knowledge by students, will be available next year. It's all open source because it is funded by the Institute of Educational Science, which is the research arm of the Department of Education. So thank you, Lee.
I was just going to ask Eva, I think we had the chat disabled during some of the time, but maybe Eva or Lee, you could just put in the chat now that it's open, the main links to get to the modules in case people miss those and the conversations.
I will, definitely. Thank you, George.
Yes, thank you. We got lots of questions about that. Also, another question that I got from Robin here, Aida, is perhaps Aida or anyone on the panel. If you could quickly go over again the domains of teacher expertise.
Yes.
That the modules were kind of based on, and it was really fast. And if I could share that slide one more time. So I'll go ahead and share that if you'd like.
Yes, of course, you can share the slide. The domains of teacher expertise include vision. So we need to, as we work in preparing teachers and as we work in developing their expertise, we need to convey a vision of students that is future oriented, where we see students, as George said, not as deficits, not as containing deficits, but rather as potential. So a pedagogy of promise, educators seeing their students with all of the resources and running with them in accelerated and deep ways. But it also presents a vision of teaching. So what does interactive, rich, deep teaching look like? There is a domain of motivation. And for those of you who are in teacher education, most of your students are really motivated. But then you find them 2 years later, after having taught for 2 years, in a school that doesn't provide them with the opportunities to learn. And unfortunately, that motivation has been eroded. So during professional development, we need to reconnect teachers with the reasons, the motives that took them into learning. There's the domain of knowledge, which is the one that we know the most about. There's reflection at the center because it's reflecting about everyday activities, reflecting about articles, reflecting about videos that really gets all the other pieces moving. And there is an understanding of the context. So what does the Department of Education tell us now? We need to meet. How do we do it in equitable ways? And finally, there is the domain of practice, in which we take all those other 5 domains and enact them, ideally in faithful, principled ways. But if you want to read more about it, kindly go to Module 1, because it's the one that presents a model and expands on it. Thank you, Lee.
And then we had a few questions also, perhaps about George's module and policy, asking about specific situations if the modules address specific situations in dealing with ELD and newcomers. For example, when there's a specialized ELD class, which might take away access to elective courses, or what teachers can do for newcomers that don't read and write in their home languages, if that's addressed in these modules.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's always the $10,000 question, right? Yeah, I would say it absolutely is addressed in not only the module that I created, but throughout all of the modules. And as with any other sort of particular population or subpopulation, there may be some adaptation of the ideas or specificity needed. But I'll just give you one example. In the module that I created, I mentioned that we talked, the third part is very specific things that teachers can do, right, in the classroom, and teacher leaders can do in the school. And one thing that we talk about is that these can be small acts, right? And so we refer people there and actually have an activity around the Santa Clara County Office of Education's resources on naming an identity. And it is, I believe it's called My Name, My Identity. And it's starting with the commitment for teachers and school leaders to actually learn students' names and to pronounce them correctly. Right. And this sounds like such a small thing, but what could be more important than a student coming into a school knowing that their teacher can pronounce their name correctly, right? And then, but the Santa Clara resource, which again is open source and free, and we've created a kind of a little walkthrough in the module to link teachers there. But that those resources have all kinds of activities that can be done with students in the classroom, and videos of students talking about their own names and their own identities. That's just one small example, but we also have guidance for instruction. And I think the key really is going back to that notion that learning additional languages is not remedial, right? So newcomer students, even if they are less experienced or have very little experience with reading and writing, even if they have had interruptions in their schooling, they still come as bright, inquisitive, thinking, in high school settings, young adults or children in elementary settings, whose imagination can be engaged, whose intellect can be engaged. And that is the entryway into learning both all this content area that they will need to learn, as well as obviously developing English, which for them is really a brand new language.
So thank you, George, because you have brought to my mind that a driving force that led the design of these modules. And that is even the one of helping colleagues become aware of the language we use so naturally, but that still presents a problematic relationship. For example, we talk a lot, I don't allow my students, or I allow my students. And just that word allow, there's an exercise that sends educators into thinking, what kind of a relationship, if I allow somebody, am I talking about a symmetrical relationship, or what am I talking about? Who allows? What characterizes somebody who allows? And so it's the exploration of even that which we do every day with the best of intentions. But as we all know, unfortunately, the best of intentions do not always unfortunately take us to the best results for students. And one final notion that is explored in a module also is the one about, do we prepare students to be college and career ready exclusively? Or do we prepare students to be community college and career ready? So what is the role of education? And in a conversation that you can find with Joel Westheimer, this is explored in depth. But I think we have used up most of our time. So I am going to pass this to Eva, who has so kindly been the engine behind the organization of all of this, because she would like to announce a way in which we would love to keep up with you, whether you use just one activity from a module, whether you use half a module, a third of a module. We would like to get some feedback in the future. So Eva.
Yes, we're thinking about developing some focus groups with educators like yourselves that decide to use the modules to whatever degree, like Aida mentioned, to whatever degree you're able to. And we would love to hear from you. The National Development and Research Center really wants to get some feedback from the field. And as Aida mentioned earlier, there are 6 modules and more to come. So your support would be ideal if you could really help us by filling out this form. It's a Google form, and what you will do with it is only giving us permission to really contact you, expressing your interest in perhaps being part of one of those focus groups. And so we can give you more information when it's available. Likely it would be in a few months, giving you plenty of time to implement the module. So we're thinking the fall of 2023, but more information will come. And if you fill out this form, we will be able to get it to you and get in touch with you. And I think at this time also mentioning that this video will be available in the center's website, and also will connect through the San Diego County Office of Education website. And thank you.
The Yolo County Office of Education as well. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much for having joined us. And we look forward to you trying the modules or components of the modules and providing feedback, because that will also be very valuable for the future. And thank you to my colleagues, George, Heather, Eva, and Lee. And of course, thank you also to Ed, who has been helping us with technology.
Thank you, everyone.